Muskogee Creek Nation, like Bobby and also Tony. And I attend Theophily Indian Baptist Church, which is in Destin. It's a Creek church, and if you know where Destin is, it's very small. If you know where Henrietta is, it's outside Henrietta. We're a rural suburb of Henrietta. To make that more complicated, when I was in my late 20s, I converted to Catholicism. So I also am a parishioner at Holy Family here in downtown Tulsa. Recently, I just moved back to Oklahoma this summer. So I'm not that unusual. A lot of indigenous people follow lots of traditions as far as their spirituality goes, and we incorporate a lot of things. And that's part of what we talk about and in the show, but it's also part of what influences our history as indigenous Christians. So I've been asked, like I said, to give some historical and cultural context, and I wrote it down because we're professors and we can talk a long time if we don't have any limits. So I'm going to try to give you about a 5-minute journey through hundreds of years of Native American Christianity. Hopefully I'll give you just enough that when you want to do your own research, you'll have somewhere to go. So that's the goal. Most often we think of Christianity in relationship to Native Americans as an oppressive force entirely, and that is definitely been true through history, from conquistadors who first came to missionaries, explorers. A lot of times Christianity was used as a weapon almost against Native American people, and that was not uncommon. It was a part of the means of forced assimilation for many years. You know, there were a lot of missionaries had good intentions, but ultimately ended up wiping out cultures, languages, belief systems. And some of them, of course, did not have good intentions as well. And the United States of America, of course, was founded to guarantee freedom of religion. Ironically, that did not include indigenous peoples. And it wasn't until 1978 that American Indian ceremonies were made legal in this country where we started. And I was 3. Today's my birthday, by the way. I was 3. Thank you. I was 3 when it became legal to practice our ceremonies. Of course, that did not mean that they weren't being practiced. They just kind of went underground, and people still did them. Of course, in the 19th century, prior to the 19th century, the boarding school system that you probably know about, Native children were taken, sometimes forcibly taken from their families, sometimes sent by families that were impoverished or had other reasons to send their kids, but were taken to these boarding schools to become Americanized. And the first ones were run by missions, so they were Christian-based. And the later ones, by the 19th century, we had the first government-run boarding school, which was actually my thesis was about that first one, Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And even in those government-run schools, Christianity was very much part of the indoctrination process for assimilation. So when we say Christianity as an institution has been cruel to indigenous people, we're not wrong. There has been a bad history there. But like all things about indigenous history, it's much more complicated than it sounds. Among southeastern tribes, of course, prior to Europeans ever coming, there was not a monolithic culture, even among any specific tribe. So everybody traded, made war against each other, traveled. So, the first Europeans weren't the first time that these tribes were exposed to different spiritual beliefs. The Christians, of course, had some firepower behind them that hadn't been there with other people. But there were a lot of things involved in that besides just conquering. So some people ignored what the missionaries had to say. Of course, they couldn't speak the same language at first, but we have to really think about the fact that a lot of these missionaries came, and if you've tried to learn some of indigenous languages, it is not easy when you're coming from a Romance language. And they learned these languages in order because they were that devoted to spreading this religion to these people that they encountered. And so they did learn English, and eventually there was more of an ability to exchange ideas. And so some people ignored them, some people denounced the new religion, and some people actually did convert and eventually found our churches, become missionaries and hymn writers. So my church and several Indian churches like it, from all the tribes, we use Christian theology, but a lot of our practices are based around our ceremonial beliefs and our structure, not just our ceremonial structure, but our cultural structure that came all the way from back in the southeastern homelands. So we have our own hymns, which hopefully you'll be hearing on First Friday. We're looking. We have our own practices, and this is a topic that could be a whole book, but basically, we're part of a cycle of churches, and you come to, say, Thewathley one week, and then the next week you go to the next church and to the next. We stay there all weekend. So when we say we go to church, we go Saturday night, and we're still there Sunday night is when we finally leave. There's a lot of fasting involved. Creeks love to fast for any reason, apparently. And a lot of just etiquette rules, everything that, if you're Creek, you know we have a lot of rules for everything, and that is including our churches. So there's a lot that goes on there. So we may have 6 or 7 preachers. Each family has a camp house. So if you go to our ceremonial grounds, you see the ceremonial dancing area in the center, and surrounded by brush arbors where each family has kind of a headquarter base. Well, our churches are similar in that we have the church in the middle, surrounded by family camp houses where we eat dinner and we serve whatever guests have come to our church. And some people go into church, hear the preachers, do the singing, do the prayers, and some people stay in those camp houses all day long and never set foot in the actual church, but nobody judges them. And I think that's part of culturally who we are, but part of history is that we as Indian people have been so forced into Christianity that we never would want to do that to each other. So that's to say that when you think of Native American Christians, you often assume it's the result of oppression, and it isn't always. There are people who chose it, and especially in modern times. But even a long time ago, your faith is inside of you, and it's not your church, it's what's inside of you. And there were a lot of people throughout history that, for whatever reason that was personal, chose that. So there are a lot of people who are Native Christians who weren't raised in Indian churches like I was. They're in Holy Family or in just a First Baptist church, for various reasons. The Indian Relocation Act of 1956 brought a lot of people to urban centers and other means of assimilation or attempted assimilation. So military service, jobs, just life took people to different churches. And so the individuality of spirituality is a large part of what we are talking about. This is what the altar is about, is that individual experience. Spirituality has always been and will always be very personal. And like all Christians, Indigenous Christians experience faith as a communion with that mystery, as well as a communal practice in their communities. So that individual experience intersects with that history that we've been talking about. And I think in one of my pieces, I said transcends it. I don't know that that's the right word, but the visible history isn't necessarily the internal experience. And so with that, now we'll have our longer introductions. I hope I didn't talk too long. I guess we'll introduce a little bit more about the spiritual background, the influences, and the art that we see here today.